Today, we're going to talk about handling a problem leader. It happens, right? Well, we're going to have a discussion about that coming up right now. Hi there, I'm Andrea Adams, and this is the HR Hub. If you've come to learn about HR, you're in the right place. I encourage you to subscribe to the show or podcast, keep learning from my guests. Today, I have two guests. Again, it is the lovely Heather Dranitsaris-Hilliard and her mother, Dr. Ann Dranitsaris. I did a couple episodes with them last fall that I loved because they totally understood me. Their expertise is dismantling organization dysfunction, and today's topic is an element of that for sure. Hello, ladies. How are you?
Yeah, excited to be back with you again.
Always a pleasure. Well, I so enjoyed those episodes last fall, and when this one came up for me, somebody asked me about it actually, and I'm like, I know the people. All right. So let's dive in. First question is, what are some signs that the leader is a problem?
The place that we always start is, and typically what comes up is that people are complaining, right? Like the conversation that's going on around the leader is complaints about something about the leader. So that's sort of an indication that there's something symptomatically going on, but whether or not it's the leader themselves or the leader within the ecosystem that they operate within, that's part of what we have to always root out to determine what our course of action is going to be.
And just to give you the flip side of this, sometimes it's the leader coming and complaining about the employees when they're not looking at their own behavior and seeing how they're contributing, especially in these days where a lot of leaders are permissive and they don't give their employees exact expectations or timelines, and then they get really frustrated with their employees when they don't meet their expectations, like they're mind readers or something, which, of course, you can look at problematic behavior in leaders from both of those sides.
I've heard both of those, and sometimes it's just like, in HR, employees are coming and they're complaining about all of the leaders. And so it's really hard. It's hard to know, but certainly that example of employers or the leaders complaining about their employees, I think that's a great clue. Okay, so when we are thinking the HR leader is a problem or a big part of a problem, what should we do in HR and what should we avoid doing?
So I'll start with that one. One of the important things is to not jump to a conclusion or a judgment about, who's right or who's wrong in the situation. And so it's trying to understand what is it that's creating this gap, right? So we always use this language of, well, what is the actual issue? Because when they come to us, when the employees come to us in HR or, in our case, in our, consulting and coaching world, they're often talking about it through the lens of their own experience, right?
Mm-hmm.
But they're doing it in a way that's saying, they're to blame and they're not doing this or they're not doing that, but they're not actually looking at the situation objectively. And that's one of the first things we always try and get at is to understand what is actually going on, what is actually happening, what is actually being said or not being said. What is it they're not getting that they need to be getting that's causing them to come to complain, and not reacting to their emotion in it. And I think we talked about this even last time.
Yeah, we did.
I mean, to separate out the feelings from the facts in the particular situation. But I think before I pass it over to Anne, the last thing I want to say is always having to remember that when we're in HR and in that role is a big part of the job is to support the leaders to be effective. And if we align ourselves out of the gate with the perspective of the employee without understanding what's actually going on, we're not aligning ourselves to be helpful and supportive of what does the leader need to be more effective with this particular employee, right? Because that's where sometimes leaders can be challenged is they might be really effective with a certain personality type or a certain kind of employee in a certain context, but that employee might not be getting their needs met. So is it about the leader? Is it about the employee? At the end of the day, it's the leader's job to give the employee what they need to perform. and to be engaged and to feel satisfied, but not in a way that the employee gets to kind of roll the roost and walk all over the leader from that perspective.
And just to elaborate on what Heather's saying, it's really important for HR people to not try and be something, because certain leaders can, they can make us feel like we have to prove our value to them just through their behavior, or we have to show them that we're competent. And we can start as HR people trying to prove ourselves, and we can go into a certain role, or even with an employee, we can act like we're their counselor or their coach and over empathize, as we talked before, instead of, as Heather's illustrating, like that, becoming a detective. You see, finding out all of the relevant facts so that you make sure that you've got the whole picture and what is the problem behavior, as opposed to just, whose fault is it and who needs to be fixed. As though, nobody else is contributing. It's just the leader's behavior, for example, or conversely, just be, a leader complaining about an employee too, where they're determined it's the employee that's the problem because they never had any issues around, delivering the right work at the right time. Their employees should not have any issues either.
So I get leaders of leaders that are really tempted to just give up. Is there really hope that we can turn the behavior of a leader around? And what are some of the options to help them do that?
We see in most cases, if a leader's not demonstrating what we need them to be demonstrating, if they're not able to be effective, if they're struggling, it's a developmental gap. Like, we have to start at it always from that place. What's the developmental gap that we need to navigate this individual through? And part of the reason why folks, both leaders and some people in HR, I know that we've encountered that I had this conversation with a client a couple of weeks ago, and the HR person is, I really don't want to spend any money on this leader because I think it's, I don't want to throw, resources at this. And yet her CEO boss was saying, 90% of what he's doing, he does really, really well in his role. And so we're going to go throw the baby out with the bathwater over a 10% discrepancy that we might be able to close with the right developmental support. And I think part of the reason why we're so quick to do that is because leaders and HR people don't know what to do to bring somebody through to close the developmental gaps. And so we hear comments like, I have another client who does this all the time. Well, you can't change their stripes and they are who they are. And
yeah.
Who they are, that's how they behave. It's like, I'm not going to develop. I'm not going to change. I'm not going to shift my behavior. So I'm not going to expect that of the people around me. So if the behavior's not working, then they've got to go. And so this is where it is starting to look at it developmentally, right? And, are there some folks that are uncoachable? Yeah, there are some folks that that really resist moving into the place of developing, but they're a very small percentage of the folks that we've experienced anyway, and that we've worked with.
The other piece of it, which a lot of leaders are really resistant about because they just don't know how to navigate this, is the giving of consequences. Because they don't go into the gray area of consequences, where you look at a consequence as something that can influence the behavior of the leader that you're talking to. And so if they're concerned, for example, about their reputation, you would want to say, if this behavior continues, I imagine that this is going to negatively impact how you're perceived in the organization and with clients. And that would be something that would motivate them. But to tell an employee, if you keep doing this, I'm going to be really pissed off at you, that's not a consequence. And, or, thinking about the final solution, as we like to call it, it's the consequence of keep doing it, we're going to fire you. Well, that's way down the road. So we filed a whole list of consequences that we give our clients so that they can go through and select the consequence in advance of a coaching conversation or a performance conversation with a leader, to help motivate them around to move into alignment based on something they need for themselves or something that matters to them.
Often leaders, organizations want things to change yesterday. But this can take some time. If we're going to keep a leader who's some degree of a problem, what's some reasonable expectations around when we can see change in that leader? I feel like, honestly, it's just so unreasonable. Like, you need to change that behavior tomorrow. And the integration of that and the alignment in a person, that just doesn't happen overnight.
I think if you break it down a little bit, though, right, is there may be something that they can absolutely stop or start that is within their control. You know, one, you have to stop yelling at your staff. That's non-negotiable. You're done. You don't do it again, right? Like, that is a behavior that they have the ability to control. When you're so it depends on what we talk about from a behavior perspective. Okay. So, again, I got a client where what was going on dynamically was, they didn't like the way he was behaving in certain situations because their interpretation was he was being rigid, he was being controlling, he was, so they had all these ways of characterizing it. And that wasn't actually the what we're trying to solve. We don't go to him and say, stop being so rigid, right?
Right.
And what we had to look at it is what is going on that is causing him to kind of trench in and argue over things. And so as we explored that, we talked about here's the process we want you to follow differently. So if I have a new process to follow while I'm developing some different skills and shifting my behavior, that gives me something that I can start to implement right away. So it's trying to break it down into what do we start with? And sometimes it is starting with an absolute black and white, this has to end. In other cases, it's how do we give you the steps to follow differently? So instead of going from A to Z, which is not working for you, you go to B next, and then to C, and then to D, and then, you've got a different way of coming about it. But again, someone has to direct these individuals. And oftentimes in organizations, the leaders and in HR they're not sort of breaking that down in that way. They're again, all or nothing sort of thinking around it. And but we do say to the clients that, typically if we don't see behavioral change within the first couple of weeks of a conversation, you go back and have the conversation again. And if you've had the conversation 3 times and there's still no change, you have to start to think maybe they're just not interested in adapting their behavior or, following you and following that expectation that you've laid out for them.
That is
not going to master it. They're not going to master it. You just want to see a sign that they're working on it.
So in HR, we've got the employee coming to us and complaining. We've got the leader coming to us and complaining about the employees. And sometimes and we know we have to do something. Sometimes the leader's powerful, though. How do we approach that conversation with the leader when if it goes badly, it could go badly for us?
Do you want to take that one first, Sam?
Sure. It was what I was alluding to earlier about we, as HR people, we have to recognize what's getting triggered in us, as though a senior leader needs to be informed any differently than a supervisor, for example. The process is exactly the same for both. It's discovering what the actual issue is, what has been attempted in order to change the behavior, and how is the leader contributing to the behavior of the employees. And, it's always a respectful questioning. I just need to know the whole picture. I need to get a better sense of everything that's going on and how you've approached it. But it doesn't have to change because we're worried about our competence and them not thinking that we're competent, you see? And that's where HR people can run into trouble because they want it to be approved of, as opposed to they want to help this human being who simply happens to be in a senior leadership role deal with an issue that they're coming to you for help with.
The other thing I'll add to that is, you think about it from an influence perspective, right? Because when you're feeling that there's a power imbalance within it, it's trying to come at what's my strategy that I'm going to use to influence this individual to, one, take in the information as effectively and as it's intended, two, to actually do something. Again, you think about a lot of the clients we work with, they can fire us on the spot if they don't like what we're saying. There's none of this having to worry about HR and company. I don't like what you said to me. You're out of here, right? And so we look at it from, I'll use language a lot like, I know it matters to you how you're seen and how your people perceive you to be. I know you're not interested in having them feel this particular way or have this kind of experience. So I always bring it back to what matters to them. What are they interested in? And while it might be hard to hear it, I'm also delivering the message in that way of it's something that's solvable, right? It's not this subjective thing. And so it's coming back to that. I think about a conversation I had with a client recently, and having to say it, you don't step into that place of really directing and defining so that you're not getting, and that results in you not getting the performance you want. And then you get these people acting out in this particular way and complaining about you. And this is the dynamic that's going back and forth. And I said, and so here's something we can do, right? So then we shift as quickly as possible into whether you agree or disagree with the feedback, let's talk about what you can do differently. So then they feel back in control. They're not having to, debate and dissect. And, I get into this I was on a call with a client earlier, and they're like, well, what exactly? You have to give me more examples. And I said, no, I don't. I said, what you have to do is understand that there's a pattern here that we're hearing. Let's talk about the one or two things that you can do differently that's going to alleviate some of this that's going on in the organization. And so because they want to go in and debate and argue it, because
yes, they do.
The resistance to doing anything with it, right? And the longer you stay in it, the more you're not actually moving them forward, right? And then you leave, and then they just feel like, oh, they were wrong. They don't know what they're talking about, and can't trust them to bring something forward because we didn't actually solve the problem for them, right? All we did was bring the problem and immerse them in it. And so that's really important when you think about, how are you navigating it, especially with these senior leaders. And, to Anne's point, I remember when I first started out, and I was like scared of some of these CEOs that I was giving feedback to. I'm not going to lie. I mean, it was like, it's like, oh, Laura, I mean, it was like 28. Here, let me go. So you're doing wrong as a CEO. But what you start to appreciate is just holding on that they're individuals that have a developmental gap, and that's where you stay in focus with them, and you take that power away, right? Now I have my power, my job, this is my power, and I'm entitled to give them this feedback and to work with them because that's what they're entrusting me to do, is to help them in this way.
Yeah, and just to add one more thing to that, because it was reminding me of our earlier conversation when we go into our imposter syndrome and think it's not my place, right? But this individual is coming to us and asking for help, you see? And if we don't think it's our place to help them, we're actually not doing our job. So we really do have to, muster up our courage, as in Heather's example of how she struggled with it. And myself, I did as well initially, but we all do. But we have to realize that there's somebody in front of us who is in need. And that's more important than our fears.
Have we talked enough about what the conversation with a problem leader should look like, Anne? Have we talked about that enough, or should we talk about that some more?
Well, thinking about a quote unquote problem leader is right. Sort of how people get stuck. It's sort of like looking at our mindsets around this person's a problem and therefore I'm going to just get rid of them, or I'm going to assume they're in the wrong because they've got the problem, which of course gets in the way of developing. And you just get rid of them and then you hire someone in and you have a similar problem.
It's so true. And it leads into my next question perfectly. But when are there clues that we need to stop trying to help this person develop? It's time to sever their employment. Oh, here we are, like, let's coach, develop. Nope, sometimes you do have to fire them.
At the end of the day, our development, we're the ones that are in control of it. We choose to develop or we choose not to develop. We choose to be self-protective, stay in the fear zone and the status quo zone, as opposed to moving into learning and growth, right? And there are some folks that we can't move out of that. One of the things that we always look for is if the manager, like the direct manager, is working harder than the individual in order to get that performance improved or shifted, that's an indication that they're not on board with the development. But it was what I was saying about earlier is it's we're not looking for mastery out of the gate. What we're looking for is someone's openness to learning. They're willing to try and practice new ways of doing something, that they're coming back and saying, okay, I did this, I thought about it, I can see where you're saying it, like that openness and that acceptance to the feedback. If you've got those things happening and you're starting to see them making an effort, then you can move along. If they're still fighting and arguing over it, telling you that you're wrong, you don't know what you're talking about, or making up all the reasons why they had to do it the way they did it, and you're not seeing even incremental effort towards behaving differently. Like I've seen some folks that we've been given to coach and we give them the feedback or what they need to do, and they go into a meeting saying, yeah, I'm being told I have to stop behaving like this and do this instead. And we're like, yeah.
And it
Like,
does.
That's just them saying, I'm not on board. I'm not buying into it. I'm not doing it. I refuse to change. I refuse to listen. I refuse to follow. And those situations become clear pretty quickly. For the most part, we find that a lot of folks, when you give them the direction that they need and you tell them and support them to actually start the shift, they can do it. A lot of the times, so I'll just say this one last thing is, a lot of the times we'll hear from a client, that I've told them. And I'm like, really? What have you told them? Because they give information, but not direction, right? And so, okay, I heard what you said, but I didn't know that meant I was supposed to do something different. And if I knew how to do it differently, I'd probably already be doing it differently. And so it's really going in and saying, did we truly support them to develop and shift? Or did we just give them information and expect them to magically figure it out on their own?
Yeah, and just to give another client example or broad client example of how many in the Myers-Briggs world, the ISTJ, in our world, the stabilizer personality type, that they are told that they need to do relationship building. It is so broad. And so, it's like, what does that mean? Does that mean I have to ask people what they did? And what does it mean? And so in the coaching sessions, we'll break it down for them and let them practice and give them words. Here's 3 questions, ask 3 questions to get it going, get them talking, then you can relax, and then you can think of things to add. And how I can do, they're so relieved because they need sequenced instructions. But a leader will often say, I shouldn't have to tell them that. I didn't need that. And again, using themselves as the standard for how everyone else should behave, which of course, that's how the leader contributes a lot of the time.
Okay, just to finish off here, this conversation around leaders is the problem. Any other thoughts or suggestions?
The fact is that leaders lead within an ecosystem, and you can't just look at the behavior in isolation. You have to look at what's going on within the dynamic. You have to look at things like process, because sometimes it's the process they're using that's the issue, not so much that the leader themselves. And a lot of the times it's some combination between the two. You have to look at it through, not just, again, that single, well, here's the problem and this is the magic bullet, fix the leader, change the leader, it's all going to work. It's everything has, there's a dynamic to it. It's between that leader and their direct manager, that leader and the systems and processes that operate within the organizational context, the employee that they've brought in and how that person works up against, or the leader's lack of awareness about what they need and how they work. And so there's a mismatch there. So it's always looking at it a bit more holistically than just bringing it down to this, let's blame the leader. It's so easy to blame there.
Or blame the employee.
Or blame the employee. Yeah, well, if we blame the employee out, no, that doesn't work either.
One or the other. It's easy to have a scapegoat.
Absolutely.
Yeah, but the problem never goes away. And, just to flesh that out about the idea of the ecosystem, leaders will often create their vision for where the business is going to be in 3 years and have their strategies, but they don't look at, what is our collective leadership capabilities? What's our vision for that in 3 years? And how are we creating a culture where everyone is working at developing themselves toward that end so that you have the leader's competence as well as where the business is going, arriving there at the same time. And so it really does boil down to, as Heather said, that holistic idea about the organization and how everybody and every part of it grows within the business context.
Thanks, Anne and Heather. I love that, just as I did last time. The part that's sticking with me right at the moment is looking at leadership and problems in a less binary way of right and wrong and more of a developmental sense. And so that's something I'm going to reflect on and hopefully incorporate into my consulting practice. And Heather and I did another couple of episodes in the fall, and links to those are right here. Thanks for watching out there. We'll see you next time.